Hi, Derek. Welcome to Twice Told.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine, and thank you for authoring this book, The Forgotten War. It's such a fascinating topic, but before we get into the nuances of the book, I'd like to walk you through what Twice Told is all about. So, Twice Told is an exchange between an author and a reader as we're sitting across each other from this virtual table, and we revisit the book. Me from the point of view of having read it, you from the point of view of having written it. Now, I'm sure you may have had different ideas when you thought about writing this book, a different idea when you wrote this book, another idea, or perhaps a set of ideas after your discussions, preliminary discussions with your editor, and subsequent iterations as well. But the book truly got told when it hit print, when the first advanced reader copies came out.
That's right.
I read the book and formed some impressions, some informed by information by reading books, some could be perhaps biases of mine, some could be imaginations. Now that I'm here, having the honor of being able to speak with you about this book right across from a table, we are revisiting this book, and I hope to I certainly will walk back with insights, but I hope there are some insights or aha moments which you may not have thought of when you were writing this book, but now that you're thinking about it, hey, I didn't think of that earlier. So
Yeah,
that's how the book comes out twice told.
I love it. That's great. That's a great approach. Looking forward to it.
Thank, thank you, Derek. Now, my first question is going to be, how did this book come about and why?
So I came across a book written by America's first female historian, Mercy Otis Warren. I had been doing research on my first book, which was about following Thomas Jefferson's travels through Europe and getting to understand and grapple with his legacy. And he owned this copy of this book by Warren. It was his personal copy. He sold a bunch of his books to the Library of Congress in Washington D.C. And there was a fire in the 19th century that burned a lot of them. And I saw this on a display once, and it had Mercy Otis Warren's book. It had a singe mark across its cover. And I thought it was how amazing, what a survivor! This book owned by the president and written by this trailblazing writer that survived just barely. And so I read a copy online, and but what caught me when I read it was just how she talked about the Revolutionary War. It was one of the very first histories of the Revolutionary War, and how the U.S. Revolution was really part of a war fought on all sorts of many different continents, many different places. And she wrote about this very matter of factly. She wasn't trying to surprise or convince anybody of the fact. All of her readers in 1805 knew this because during the war they were tracking in the newspapers what was going on in other parts of the world. So that just really opened up my eyes because I had some vague awareness that France was involved obviously and some other countries, but just the depth of involvement from all of these other nations really piqued my interest. So I decided to set out on the road to learn more and do research in libraries, but also to physically go to a lot of places where these battles happened and where treaties were negotiated, and try to find people on the ground, local historians, reenactors, in some cases descendants of people who were involved in these events, to who had kept the memory alive of what had happened, and asked them to share the stories with me. So I was inspired by her book, and it set me off on this rabbit hole after rabbit hole. So for about 4 to 5 years of exploring all these different facets of the Revolutionary War as a world war.
Understood. Would you have a rough back of the envelope calculation of how many books have been written about the Revolutionary War?
Oh, I don't have the number, but I mean many, 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 many. And the interesting thing is they almost all focus solely or almost completely on the fighting in what were the 13 original colonies. There have been some books over the years that have focused on the global nature here and there, but I feel like it really hasn't sunk in to the public consciousness here in the United States. And going to school, it's certain that was not at all the focus of the history of the Revolutionary War that we heard in school. So the idea that so I really felt like something was missing from a lot of those books. All the fighting that happened in America was obviously very, very important, but it was just one theater of this broader war, and I wanted to explore these other theaters.
Understood. Your book deeply humanizes the subject, and your passion for writing and your involvement in the nation's history shines through so brightly. No one will deny this. You're traveling through these places, reliving these moments, speaking to descendants of people who had fought in this war, and of course, outlining the global nature, which is fantastic. Kudos to you for that, Derek. I found this deeply impressionable and also admire the fact that you're not trying to paint a hagiographic picture, you're not trying to pontificate, you're not speaking from some temple altar of authority. You're speaking as this person who's traveling through this countryside, and yes,
Well,
this is how it
thank you
rolled
for
out.
that. I'm glad that resonated with you. And you're right. I didn't want to come. I shared my own personal experience and how my mind changed as I went to some places. But I definitely wanted this to be factual and to let the reader draw whatever conclusions they want from this wider history that we haven't heard about. So yes, I wanted to kind of learn what I could and share that as if almost I'm out there on the road and I'm back at the hotel or wherever it is, and talking to somebody there, in the hotel lobby or a bar or whatever, to say here's what I found out today, and shining a light on kind of some of these lesser known parts of our history.
Understood. Now, diving into the book, I'd like to ask you a question about who were some of the major and minor European players in the North American continent, and what was the relationship with one another?
Sure. So um, in North America at the time of the Revolutionary War, which the real active fighting started in 1775, so even a year before the Declaration of Independence was issued, uh, major players were Britain and France and Spain. And um, Britain being by far, the British being the real dominant player here. So much had changed thanks to the 7 Years' War, which in America is often called the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. And this was a tremendous victory for Britain. They took over, they took a lot of territory away from France and Spain, who were on the other side of the fighting. There are many other nations involved too. Um, one of the key facts being that Britain took over the province of Quebec from France. So the French were out of Canada. Uh, the French had the Louisiana province, which headquartered based in New Orleans, but then that spread west, encompassing many U.S. states today. And they actually transferred that out after the war to Spain. Almost to say that they were sorry, because the French were the ones who brought the Spanish into this war, and it was a terrible defeat for both of them. And it was more than just that, but it was also a very expensive province to be in and to maintain and govern. So they gave it to the Spanish. So, but the British had taken over land in what was called the Floridas. Not just the state of Florida today, but Alabama and Mississippi in that area. So France and Spain had been somewhat marginalized by this war. I mean, they still both had empires, to be sure, but both the countries felt that the balance of power had shifted to Britain, and they wanted to do something about that. So that's a very rough idea of who some of the players were. Native American tribes were very powerful at this time too, particularly kind of on the western fringes of the British settlements. So there were a lot of different players, and of course the American colonists were chafing under British rule and starting to have a lot of grievances.
Understood. Now, what are your thoughts on perhaps a hidden war or a more abstract war which was happening in the background, and the American independence or the war for independence was merely one of those outcomes from this greater abstract movement folding out, something similar to the revolutions of 1848? Do you think there's something more global or deeper at play here?
Yes, I think that's a good question. I think that was part of it. It started as a colonial conflict, and certainly was instigated by the American colonists, who were upset at British rule and British policies. But this was also, of course, the age of the Enlightenment, and there was certainly a general push for more liberty and independence. Um, the American cause was very popular in France, which was interesting. There was an absolute monarchy, and even noblemen liked the philosophical ideas, though, that Americans were espousing about liberty. And I think that wound up influencing some people during the French Revolution, which started only 6 years after the Revolutionary War ended. And some of those ideas caught on in Spain. I think their independence movement took longer to come to fruition, in part because Spain cracked down pretty ruthlessly on whatever independence movements they saw, or whatever protest movements they saw happening. They did not want a revolutionary war on their watch in their colonies in Latin America. But decades later, you know, the independence movements very much look to the American Revolution as an inspiration. And there is actually there's one guy, Francisco de Miranda, who participated in all of these revolutions. He was this Spanish officer who was both in the American Revolution and went over to France and then participated in the Bolivarian revolution in South America. So he is the tangible link. I'm not going to give him credit for starting all these revolutions, but it was interesting that it showed that he was actually somebody who managed to travel around to all of them. And a lot of other people probably would have done that if they had the opportunity, because it was really remarkable, what the Americans were aiming for, for democratic self-governance. So yeah, that definitely resonated with a lot of people around the world.
Understood. This Francisco de Miranda sounds so much like Captain America before Captain America, the cartoon character even came out.
Yeah. Somebody needs to make a movie about this guy. Yes. Make a action movie, the guy in all the revolutions.
Seriously. Now, returning back to the book, now, what are some of the lesser discussed motives for the American colonists to secede from Britain? No taxation without representation is understandable, but when you do the maths, the tax on tea would not quite justify the costs for war, the cost for men, material, and not just so much of destruction and devastation. So, what are some of the motives that are not discussed so much in today's time and age?
Yeah, no, that's a good way to frame it. You're right. I mean, just from a cost benefit analysis, yeah, pay the tax on tea would have been much cheaper than embarking on this war, which cost millions and millions of dollars, so many lives. But of course, it was for a lot bigger issues than the financial part of just paying the tax itself. It was about self-governance, about the right to determine uh, taxes and other laws. America, I think, it was a very prosperous. The 13 colonies were in general doing pretty well economically, yet still restricted by British policies, economic policies, and restricted politically. George Washington, for example, always resented. He had fought in the 7 Years' War, but never got to have a full-fledged career as an officer in the British, as a commissioned officer in the British Army, and he always felt slighted. And a lot of colonists, of the leaders, felt slighted that they could never break into and be fully accepted into the ranks of British leadership. So there are many different political ideals at play, and this growing sense of American identity. I think another factor that's not talked about as much probably as it should be was a lot of Americans wanted to keep expanding west, and that was leading to clashes with Native American tribes, and the British government actually put limits on that, and Americans didn't like those restrictions. So that was a part of the growing resentment too, that they thought that Britain was preventing American settlers from fulfilling what they thought was their right to keep moving west. There was eventually, after the so-called Boston Tea Party, England, I think, also overreacted. Excuse me. They overreacted, and they put very harsh measures, imposed harsh measures on the colonists, including closing the port of Boston completely, which was just close to a death blow for the economy. So there were so many different factors that triggered the revolution, and I think they just kind of all came together. Probably different ones of these causes that I mentioned kind of motivated different people in different ways.
Was there something like mass starvation, people unemployed, like 80% of the population unemployed, not able to afford one square meal, something similar to what happened during just preceding the siege of Bastille?
No, and that's not quite like that. No, and that's an interesting contrast. I think that France, the peasants, in France were were in fact starving, and it was just a dreadful situation. America was fairly prosperous. There were a lot of raw materials and a lot of opportunities for farmers to get land that they wouldn't have had in Europe. So, of course, there was also the practice of slavery. So, for a large part of the population, this was a really difficult system to live under, because obviously they were working in bondage without liberty. But for those who weren't, they were doing well. They were doing better compared to your average Frenchman, for sure. And so that's kind of one of the ironies, like why the revolution? Here? Why did it happen here when people were not suffering to that degree? But I think they were motivated by some of these other factors we talked about.
Understood. I was just trying to wrap my head around the fact that what is it that when there are these fiscal or profitability measures or motives which could prompt for leading to war, that we oust the government and take matters into our own hands. Second is the emotional or desperation. The emotional aspect being that there's so much tyranny we cannot possibly survive, and the desperation in terms of lack of food, lack of clothing, lack of material, and the immense or unspeakable oppression. I was just trying to come out. Were there some of these factors as well, which we perhaps may have forgotten over the years, but you may have read in the book that you'd mentioned?
Yeah, and I mean, there certainly was some. There was a lot of unhappiness with British rule, for sure, and the closing of the Boston port was just, and the restrictions on the Massachusetts, the provincial legislature from meeting. These really hit hard. These people saw this as such an overreach, and people were suffering in Boston, for sure. And there was just a lot of um, I don't want to say paranoia, but real fear that these measures were just a sign of more to come, and just a deep, deep mistrust of the British government on the part of the colonists. So I think that's what motivated. Now, it didn't motivate everybody. There were real fault lines within American society, right? Maybe say this is a very back of the envelope calculation, but maybe a third of the people wound up being very committed to the patriot cause, as it was called. About a third were loyalists and wanted the crown to remain in power. And then a kind of third in the middle was kind of playing the field and keeping their options open and wanted to see what was going to happen ultimately, and didn't necessarily want to stick their neck out for either side. So it's not to say that everybody was on board at all times. And obviously that division kind of was dynamic and changed over time. But the group that was most upset by British policies, obviously, was the one that wound up driving the conversation.
Understood. Now, you mentioned about America or the Continental Army invading Quebec and failing pretty badly. But what if the Continental Army had prepared better for it? Would we have seen a bigger New York state, which now also included the province of Quebec, or would Britain have taken it back?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And this is a part of the Revolutionary War I really didn't know much about, that quite surprised me, that in the very early months of the war, the Americans decided to invade Canada, which seems kind of reckless in a way, because it was so this is, to back up, this is in 1775. The Declaration of Independence had not yet come out, but we were effectively at war with the British. And Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, the battles had already happened. George Washington was now at the head of the newly formed Continental Army, but it was lacking in a lot of things. It didn't have adequate gunpowder, enough guns. It wasn't trained. It didn't have an artillery. Even if it did have cannons, it didn't have trained military engineers. And most of all, no Navy. So they're just at a tremendous disadvantage compared to the British. So you would think, okay, they're going to hunker down and do the best they can. Instead, they decided the best defense is a good offense, and took the war into Canada, hoping, probably naively, that the inhabitants of Quebec would rise up and join them and would also want to rebel against Britain. It did not work out like that. It wound up, the Americans had some initial success. They took Montreal without a fight. They had to take a couple of forts along the way, and then they took Montreal, but they failed to take the Quebec City, which was heavily fortified, and they finally attacked in the middle of a snowstorm on New Year's Eve, 1775, and failed. So, to get to your question, could it have worked better? Maybe. That's one of those interesting what ifs of history that we'll obviously never know. If the Americans had done diplomacy, I think that would have played a good factor. Benjamin Franklin and some others actually did travel up to Canada in the spring of 1776, but it was too little too late. I mean, the diplomatic overtures, at that point, the Quebecois could tell which side was winning because and it wasn't the Americans at that point in Canada. So maybe if they had engaged the Canadians more, other problems, they didn't cut, the American army didn't have enough guns, didn't have enough gunpowder, was stricken with disease. They had money, they had a new currency, but it was depreciating rapidly. And so the farmers there in Quebec could tell that American money wasn't worth nearly as much as British pound sterling. So they kind of, they didn't join in, and maybe it wouldn't have been successful anyway, because Britain sailed in 1776 up the St. Lawrence River with a heavily armed armada. So maybe the writing would have been on the wall anyway. But it's one of those interesting what ifs, like because the British had, and I guess I should have started with this, the British had not defended Canada very well at all. They were not expecting an attack from the American colonists, their own colonists to the south. So it was lightly defended in 1775. And who knows, history maybe could have turned differently, and there would be a bunch of, there'd be a union of Canada and the US, but obviously instead it went a different way.
Absolutely right. Instead of larger New York State, North America would have probably been Greater Canada, for all we
Could have
know.
been, could
And
have been, yeah.
what I liked about the way you've written is you sketch this bunch of amateurish men going about this endeavor with zero planning or and even an iota of an idea of what to expect in Canada. They could have, in principle, invoked a greater war, which would have
Mhm.
probably reversed all of their successes at Lexington and Concord, and possibly the British could have dealt a crippling blow, which would have defeated the whole war effort. And when we analyze war, and given how we analyze wars today, looking at profitability, motive, military capability, this strikes out so. What were you thinking that you
Yeah,
possibly wanted to mount this effort?
I was thinking that too as I read about this, and as I went to these, what were they thinking? They were very confident. I will say they were very self-confident about what they were doing, and it was, I think a part of it was maybe just the lack of intelligence, military intelligence, that the Americans had done some outreach to some of the English speaking merchants, mostly Protestants, who were in Quebec and who were sympathetic with what they were hearing come out of Boston, but they had not done the outreach to the vast majority of the people who lived there. The habitants, as they were called, were French speaking. They were Catholic. They had just very different views, and maybe they could have found a way to make kind of common cause with them, but it didn't happen. It wound up being a total debacle, and yes, put a lot of the American military strength had really diminished it at that time. So I think they were lucky to get out of Canada with whoever managed to retreat at the end. It was probably lucky that they got back home.
Understood. Now, Europe and European players have a major part to play in this war, especially the French and to a smaller degree the Spanish. And of course, the Dutch. We'll be getting to that in a moment. But what was Europe's reluctance in dealing with the Americans until they had ratified themselves as a nation? Why were they insistent on this particular bit of legalese?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and that was in American minds from the beginning. That they knew. We were just talking about all the obstacles and challenges faced by the American army. That they didn't have all this. They had a lot of people that could serve as soldiers, but they were lacking many other parts of the army, and they didn't have a navy at all at the beginning. Navies being extremely important in the 18th century in warfare, and so the idea was we need some kind of help from European superpowers, particularly the French and the Spanish being the two biggest that could counter Britain. And these monarchies did not want to, or felt they couldn't provide above ground support to what was basically a group of rebels. It would just break with their their protocol. It was just under international law. You can't. I mean, these are not nations. They had no problem secretly arming the Americans, which the French and Spain did. France and Spain did from a very early date, but King Louis XVI and Carlos III of Spain did not want to be in the position where they're making deals with unofficial groups, and they want to make sure too, not just in terms of making everything correct legally, that this group was going to stick around. And so that was another thing that the Declaration of Independence accomplished. It showed France and Spain and other powers that, yes, we are a real nation. This is not just a uprising that's going to fade away, that we're in it for the long haul, and that we are a real thing, and you can sign an alliance, a treaty of alliance with us. You can make contracts with us. America's open for business. So I think that was a real game changer in terms of ultimately bringing those countries into the war.
Understood. Now that you put this perspective across, I have another point. Did Europe or Europeans have the idea of terrorism back then? Not in the way that we have it today, but was that a possible fear that we are supporting a bunch of renegades and brigands and pirates, possibly? And that might be seen negatively among other European nations. We are seen
Yeah.
supporting these upstarts.
I think that's part of it. I think, yes, it was just beneath their dignity to deal with, right, a group that was still had allegiance to another power, and they were in effect, right, rebels, pirates. It was a bit of a touchy situation for France and Spain, because remember, these are absolute monarchies themselves, and it's one thing to say, okay, well, there's this new nation, the United States. This is this is who we're dealing with. But if you're just merely dealing with people who say, yes, we're still British subjects, we just want to fight them, King George, because we're upset about different things. That definitely wasn't the precedent they wanted to set. That it's okay that so having the U.S. be formally declared as a sovereign power was really important, and that was one of the lines in the Declaration of Independence towards the very bottom of the document. One of the clauses stated that in effect that it's a new nation that can now enter into treaties of alliance.
Understood. And yet we have this Dutch colonial outpost, Statia, that gives its allegiance to the fledgling United States. How is it that a colonial outpost could take such a momentous decision that possibly even the Dutch crown might balk at? Wasn't this overstepping their measure, or wasn't this, in an American parlance, isn't this above their pay grade?
Yes. Well, I think it's a really interesting story, and it was a great gesture from this Dutch island. But yes, they were above their pay grade, and they kind of got slapped down a bit from the Dutch because of it. But the story is in 1776 in November, so a few months after the Declaration of Independence, an American brig sailed into the harbor of this island that's nicknamed Statia. It's really the full name is Saint Eustatius. It remains part of the Netherlands today. It's in the Leeward Islands, very small island. I think it's a quarter the size of Manhattan, and with only a few thousand people that live on it then, and probably might be more that lived on it back in the 1700s, because it was really the hub of the Caribbean trade for the Dutch, and it had this market that ships would stop in from all over the world. And this was a place that American ships were going to constantly to get gunpowder and muskets that they needed. And Dutch merchants from Amsterdam were more than happy to ship them. And sometimes they were hidden even in boxes of tea. At the very bottom of the box, you'd find some muskets. But the key was none of the great European powers wanted to officially take on Britain at that time. So if they in 1776, it was just, they weren't ready, and it was just too risky for them. They weren't prepared yet for war, and the Dutch definitely didn't want to be at war with Britain. So if they officially said, and Britain had banned all arms traffic to the American rebels. So if they had been above board selling these guns, it would have prompted Britain to declare war on the Dutch. So this is all underhanded. But when the American ship, the brig, sailed into Statia that fall, the Dutch governor was so excited, he ordered a big salute from the cannons, and the Americans loved it. Like, they saluted him right back. And this is great. It was the first salute of the American flag by a foreign power in our history. So it's pretty significant. When the British found out about it, because they were just on the next island over, they were, of course, were infuriated, and they demanded that the Dutch governor be sacked and go to prison, and wrote all these angry diplomatic letters. And the Dutch, they didn't want to go to war with Britain, so they gave him a little bit of a slap on the wrist, let it blow over, send him back home. And after a year or so, they sent him back to stations. So it blew over. I think it was kind of both an interesting and some funny aspects to it, but still pretty moving, and still something that the people of Statia take very seriously. It's reenacted every fall, so I got to go to it a couple years ago and witness this event. So it's such a cool thing that it's still remembered down there.
Understood. While reading this, I was just imagining a possible Twitter thread, assuming Twitter existed back then, the internet existed back then, the Dutch tweeting like, "Hey, go for it, Americans," and the British are like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah, it
And
was
a whole,
it was maybe lucky for the Dutch that it took so much time. There was no Twitter, and it took months for the letters to get back and forth, and tempers could cool down maybe a little bit in the meantime. But yes, it was a bit of a faux pas, but it was a morale boost for the Americans. I mean, they were certainly happy to see this was the first time somebody said, "Oh, you actually do recognize us as a real sovereign power."
Understood. Now, moving on to the French, could you tell us about the evolution of French support for the American Revolution, beginning with hesitancy and then later pledging fully fledged support for the American nation? And how did this
Sure.
happen?
Yeah, the French were very interested in the American rebellion even before it happened. They had spies, agents, checking out things, monitoring things in the colonies from time to time, and they were predicting there would be a rebellion years before it happened. They're pretty smart guys, and they saw this as a tremendous opportunity to, in effect, to get back at Britain, not just for pure revenge, but to restore what they saw as the balance of power, which they thought France should be right there at the top along with England. And so they started giving aid to the Americans early on in the very first years of the war. But as I've been saying, this was all still smuggled and hidden, and it wasn't above board. The entire king and court were not ready, in his cabinet were not ready to officially take that step of fighting Britain. And part of what France wanted too, why they didn't just jump at the day after they got a copy of the Declaration of Independence, they realized they needed more time to build up their navy, to train their army. They hadn't fought in a while. They didn't want to lose another war to Britain. So they knew they needed some more time to get ready. And Spain was even a little more reluctant. They took even more time to get ready. So these countries didn't join officially in the war until the middle part of the war. But that early aid was still very crucial. One of the early turning points was in the war was the Battle of Saratoga in the fall of 1777, a great American victory. And one historian has estimated 90% of the arms used there were from France. So Washington and his men were doing the fighting, but they were doing it with French arms.
Understood. And at this time, when France is surreptitiously supporting the colonists, was Britain not infuriated about this? And did they not strike elsewhere at French colonial outposts, possibly?
They yes, they were infuriated, but no, they did not strike anywhere that would have really. I mean, they didn't want France in the war officially. Yes, they had their spies. They knew everything that was going on. They knew that that France was giving a huge amount of aid to the Americans, as was Spain, and was lying about it. And they knew that they were secretly allowing American privateers to use their port. A privateer was somebody who captained a ship, and it had a commission to be able to prey on enemy shipping. So America had these. It was almost like legalized piracy. American had ship captains out there picking off British ships and taking their cargo and reselling it. And France was helping with this, although they denied it officially. So it was this whole dance where, the British ambassador to France would be furious, and the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, would meet with him. And Vergennes, of all of the cabinet members, he was the one who was most pro-war and thought this was the best in France's best interest. He was trying to trying to coax his country into war and to prepare for war. And Vergennes would just lie to his face and say, "Oh no, that's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear about that. Well, we had nothing to do with it, and I'll be sure to look into it." So we would give him the kind of the runaround and try to keep Britain from pushing the matter anymore. But yes, that's what happened in the first couple of years of the war. This kind of diplomatic dance, and um, that was one reason the British wanted to try to win the Revolutionary War as quickly as they could in the first year or two, because they knew the longer they waited, the more chance that France and Spain might come in, and then they'd really have trouble.
Right. Now, were you able to uncover any material on why Britain was so lukewarm in its response to France? Given that Britain had a powerful navy, what were the odds that they could just send a fleet over across to Normandy and, yes, threaten the French? Stop this business or we're going to burn you down.
I think the British realized that they had their hands full with the American rebels. That they thought they could they initially were overconfident and that thought they could kind of clean out the rebels in the first year or so of the war. And turned out that even though the British had a lot of military victories on the battlefield, Washington's army stuck around and they survived. And they realized that this war was going to be harder and more costly than they thought. Taking France and Spain on as well would have, and which is what ultimately happened, of course, wound up just making things much, much more difficult for England. The British had the most ships of the line, as they were called, the battleships, normally of 50 cannon or more, and several tiers. They had more than either France or Spain, and way more. The Americans didn't have any. But if both France and Spain came in together, they would have more ships of the line than the British. And so it would put British colonies at danger, and potentially even England itself at danger. So their plan A was definitely quash the rebellion in the first year or two, and then go back to the kind of cold relations they had with France and Spain.
Understood. Now, moving on to financiers for the war on the Continental Army side, who were these people, and did you encounter any possible hucksters or fraudsters who falsely claimed to represent the Continental Army but made money from France and Spain and just disappeared into history?
I didn't find that. I didn't find too many of them myself. I think what you did see in the early years of the war was a whole lot of European officers going as to volunteer to join the American cause. And this was, for a couple of them, it might have been because they really believed in the cause of liberty, but for many of them, it was for personal advancement. There was no war going on in Europe, and you're not going to advance if you're a military officer, sitting around your barracks, or maybe you don't even have a commission. So a lot of French officers, and also Polish and Prussians and others, all started trying to get letters from the American agent in Paris and sailing over. And I write about some of them in the book that wound up making great contributions. But some of these were also the hucksters, as you talk about, or people who padded their resume, beyond belief, and wanted a great position in the American army with high pay. And the Americans got sick of a lot of these pretty quickly, because they didn't have a lot of money to pay officers. They had plenty of American officers who wanted those positions. So that wound up being a point of friction for sure. But as I write in the book, there are several key volunteers, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who did make great contributions.
Understood. That's interesting that no one went to France claiming that we represent the Continental Army. If you pay me in bullion, in gold coin, I'll ship this over across to George Washington and team, but just simply take that money and just disappear off to some Caribbean islands. And
Yeah, it could have happened. Maybe that would be uh, a great fictional story too. You could imagine someone trying to pull that scheme. But French were pretty savvy too. They had a real a very strong spy network, and so they probably did their homework. They figured out who was who.
understood. Now, speaking about doing the homework, did the French or the Spanish do the math on how much did it eventually cost to free America from Britain, given that just within 6 years you had the French Revolution happening? And I'm pretty sure that it's because debts were building up, and piled over so high that the government possibly couldn't manage. So were they monitoring these pro project costs, if I may call it that way?
Yeah. Well, the costs were staggering. They were immense, and they were keeping track of the costs, but probably not understanding the full repercussions. So, one historian has estimated that France and Spain spent the equivalent of 30 billion US dollars just in direct aid to the Americans. So that's not even counting the pay for their soldiers and sailors, and the Navy. Maintaining a Navy was extraordinarily expensive. And all throughout the war, France and Spain and Britain too were all building new warships. So it was a very expensive endeavor for them. That was it put the France was already in debt, and they had a poor collection system of collecting taxes, and this made it worse. I think probably most historians wouldn't say this was the cause of the French Revolution, but it certainly didn't help, and it added quite a bit to the French debt. And as I mentioned earlier, just 6 years after the Revolutionary War ended, the French Revolution started. So there's definitely a through line there.
Understood. Now, you mentioned about France and Spain deciding to attack England and landing a fleet at Plymouth. Could you tell us more about this?
This was I thought it was a really fascinating story that I had not heard a thing about. This almost never makes the history books, but in the summer of 1779, so right in the middle of the war, France and Spain had this plan to invade England itself. So in the Revolutionary War, we're always, reading about Virginia and Massachusetts and New York State, and there's no invasion of England in the story. Of course, it didn't happen. It failed. It didn't work out. But they had this armada. There had not been an armada that big since the time of the Spanish Armada in the 16th century. Just this huge fleet with also 60,000 troops poised on troop transports to make the crossing, because the English Channel obviously isn't that wide, but it was just plagued by problems. The French and Spanish navies hadn't worked together before. They were supposed to rendezvous in the Bay of Biscay, north of Spain, and everybody was late, especially part of the Spanish fleet, like months late. And the ships are just sitting out there baking in the sun all summer, waiting for everyone to assemble. And finally, they rushed off and didn't have enough food and water. Disease, broke out. So they never did make a landing. Eventually, the diseases were so bad on board that they had to abort the operation. But this armada struck a lot of fear into people in England, as you'd imagine. And if they had and they outnumbered the British significantly. The British did not have a fleet that big protecting their own homeland. So if the Spanish and French had better luck or better planning and had landed, they absolutely could have marched through England. And their plan, they didn't want to conquer England. They didn't want to occupy it. They just wanted to really scare the English and then sue for peace. It's like, okay, like we're going to march right up to London, and then you're going to cut a deal and let America be free and let Spain get the territory it's wanted. And boom, problem solved. The war's over. So that was the plan. It was a very audacious plan. The Spanish were the ones pushing it, but it didn't work out. But again, I thought this was just a fascinating kind of part of history that we hadn't heard about. Like, England itself almost faced an invasion, did face an invasion, almost had a landing force on its own shore.
Understood. Again, even in this chapter, the amateurishness of this comes out so brightly out. And given that in less than 30 years, Britain and France would be at war now with Napoleon at the helm, and looking at the professionalism of those battles that unfolded, like the Battle of Trafalgar, and so many other land engagements as well, which were
Mhm.
done with greater efficiency, professionalism. The British were supporting the Portuguese and the Spanish in fighting against the French. So, do you think that this was perhaps a try a dry run or a trial for uh, far more professional engagement in the years to come?
That's a good way of looking at it. I think all of the armies and navies did learn something from these engagements. You're right. This was the invasion was a really interesting idea, but not executed well at all. Just a comedy of errors. Um, there are a few officers who continued on from the Revolutionary War into the Napoleonic Wars and the French and the Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s. Of course, most notably, Horatio Nelson himself was on his first command and was fighting the Spanish in Central America. So he cut his teeth during the American Revolution. So yes, I'm sure they drew a lot of lessons, and I think they also studied the naval tactics of the British Admiral Rodney, who um, was just this great tactician, and I think Nelson and others copied some of his maneuvers later. So yeah, it probably was a trial run in a manner of speaking. And yes, a lot of this was, especially in those early years, was quite improvised by all of the parties involved.
Understood. Now, speaking about mercenaries in the British Army, especially the Hessians, how were they featuring in this fight? Were they in for the cash, or were they part of some diplomatic treaty with Holland?
So these are from German soldiers from different principalities. I mean, there was no Germany, of course, at the time. There are many different small states. A lot of these soldiers came from the states of Hesse-Hanau or Hesse-Kassel. I think about 65% of them did. So they were called Hessians, but many weren't. They're from other areas. And this was a deal cut by King George III of Britain. He needed more manpower. And so he hired these soldiers, which was a fairly common practice at the time for European powers to do. They technically were called auxiliaries because they weren't, as opposed to a mercenary who's just like a gun for hire that the soldier himself um, signs up with whomever will pay him. While this was a deal cut for their state with Britain, definitely for money. That was the only reason. And but even though they may not have technically been mercenaries, the Americans certainly, the Patriots certainly called them mercenaries, and just really played up the fact that here is our supposed, the head of the British Empire, King George, sending German foreigners, mercenaries here to attack his own subjects. So this was just like a PR, coup for the Americans. And the Hessians, some of the Hessians did commit some atrocities, unfortunately, because they were just professional soldiers in it for the pay, and they were happy to plunder, towns when they took them. So that definitely added fuel to the kind of the outrage that many Americans had against the British.
Understood. Now, one more aspect of the amateurishness or outrageousness in this war is in the chapter when you mentioned the Rock of Gibraltar. The British simply refused to release this and thereby antagonize Spain, all for what? Just a rock? Did this offer any strategic oversight across the Gibraltar Pass? Did this
It
mean
did.
that there were tolls that they could possibly collect?
It did, yes. So Gibraltar, it's still British to this day. It's a British overseas territory, and it's in kind of in the southeastern tip of Spain, and it was strategically important in terms of controlling that part of the Mediterranean. And the Rock of Gibraltar is a 1,400 foot tall promontory with heavily fortified at the top. The Moors had developed it. The Spanish took it at some point, but the British had taken it from them in the early 1700s. And Spain was obsessed with this rock. They just wanted it back so badly. They even privately let it be known to the British before they entered the war, like, if you just give us Gibraltar, we'll forget all about this alliance, possible alliance with France, and we'll just stay out of the war. And the British said no, they would not give up Gibraltar. And George Washington later heard about this deal that the British rejected, and he just said this was insane. He used the word insanity. That as a result, Britain, because France, I don't think France could have kept fighting throughout without Spain, and Americans really needed the French and Spanish help. So you could make the argument that Britain, in effect, traded America for Gibraltar. That they'd rather hang on to Gibraltar, and they lost the 13 colonies as a result. So it's an interesting choice, but it does remain British today. And of course, we visited that, which is a really interesting experience too. You can see a lot of the siege tunnels they have and the cannons they still have. It's an event very much remembered in Gibraltar because the Spanish laid siege to Gibraltar for about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, and just huge, huge clashes, and they never did succeed in taking it.
Understood. But I hope that this deal for Britain was worth the material consideration, given that they lost the 13 colonies for this. And I concur with George Washington in saying this is insane. Why would you stick on to this rock when you had the 13 colonies that you could have possibly retained?
Yes, maybe if with the benefit of hindsight, they should have. With the benefit of hindsight, maybe they wouldn't have enacted the Tea Act and all those other things, well, provocations. But certainly, let Gibraltar go. It's a few thousand people. The American colonies were very profitable, but King George was pretty stubborn, and he did not want to give it. He thought of the kind of the domino effect. He was really worried that you give one colony up, then the others are going to go too. So he wanted to hang on to everything.
Understood. Now, moving the theater of war's focus from Americas to India, you mentioned about Tipu Sultan, but before Tipu Sultan came into the picture, I was looking to see if you would mention about the East India Company's atrocious taxation in Bengal, which resulted in the Bengal famine of 1772.
Yes, I didn't cover that. I would have liked to have covered that in my book. I thought it was important, but it was just a question of limitations, and um, I just didn't have the space to cover all of the kind of different aspects of this. But yes, that was the horrendous famine that with the East India Company's taxation continuing throughout that was happened before the Revolutionary War, and it was kind of in Americans' minds, and many American observers did think that the East India Company was that the British government in America was kind of turning into more and more something like the East India Company, just not providing rights and acting very ruthlessly. So they certainly, especially when Britain started clamping down on provincial congresses, they said, this is just like the East India Company. So it was certainly an example that people had in mind.
Understood. Now, coming back to America and focusing on Louisiana, I, you mentioned that this was originally French, then handed back to the Spanish. But then how did this come back to the French again when Napoleon sold the Louisiana tract to the Americans as part of the Louisiana Purchase? So how did it revert back to the French?
It was under the time of Napoleon. The French reacquired it for not that long. I think it was just a couple of years, if I remember right, before they sold the territory um, to the Americans under President Jefferson. So yeah, Louisiana. So I think in our minds, in America we often think of it as French. It started as a French colony, and at the very end, when it was sold, it was French. So you might naturally just assume, well, this is a French place. But in reality, the Spanish controlled it for close to 40 years. And it's just as much really a lot of Spanish, or like at least a very heavy Spanish cultural heritage there too.
Understood. This book must have been quite the challenge for you to write, given that so many names, so many places. I mean, as our conversations, we're just darting from continent to continent, country to country, province to province. Now, moving back toward Bernardo de Galvez, what did he do so differently, and how is it that he is such a prominent figure in our history? When you look at all the other chapters of war, you see such amateurish action, and then comes
Yeah.
this professional. He turns things around.
Yes, that's a great. I love the way you framed it there. Yes, compared to especially some of the other debacles in Quebec and the failed invasion of England. So just to set the scene, because yes, there's so many names, and you can sometimes lose the forest for the trees because there's so much going on. This is a world war with multiple theaters. So France officially joins the war in 1778. Spain joins officially the very next year. And they immediately launch the Armada against England. They immediately lay siege to the Rock of Gibraltar, and multiple theaters are being opened up now in the war. And Britain is very worried about the Caribbean and all their sugar islands like Jamaica, because those are the most profitable colonies that they have. And then yet another front, another theater to add to all of those places I just mentioned, Europe and the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Then another theater winds up being the Gulf of Mexico. So Bernardo de Galvez was a young man, just in his early 30s, who became the governor of this province of Louisiana. He was also a general. He came from a small town in the hills of Andalusia, and it was very much a self-made family. They were shepherds, and his uncle Jose became a lawyer and rose through the ranks and became the minister for the Indies. Bernardo's father, Matias, also was a prominent leader in the government and also a general. And so Bernardo was a leader both politically and militarily, and he was an excellent one. So finally, the allies and the partners' luck began to change, I think, after some of these defeats. They were starting to find a way to work together better. There was a clash between the Spanish in Louisiana and the British in the Floridas colonies. The British actually had more resources there. Bernardo was undermanned, but he developed his own coalition army that he raised himself of not just Spanish, but of the French settlers, of German settlers, of free blacks, some American volunteers. They did a lightning campaign against the British because he had gotten advance word that Spain was entering the war. His uncle had tipped him off. It said, by the time you open this letter, we'll have declared war. So he had a head start, and he surprised the British. He took some of their forts in Louisiana along the Mississippi. He eventually took another one in Mobile, and then the key to the Gulf of Mexico in Pensacola, Fort George, an important fort that the British had there. And he was a great general. He was able to mobilize his men, as I said, men from all sorts of different backgrounds. He led by example. He would go out there and take personal risk himself and sleep on the ground with his men and share their food. And when he was attacking Pensacola, there was a dangerous maneuver where the ships would have to sail over the sandbar under British fire. And the other ship captains were all worried, and some of them refused to go. They said it was too risky. And Bernardo said, I will go first. If no one else will follow me, I'll go yo solo, all by myself. And he did. And the actual professional Navy captains were kind of embarrassed, so they all followed. And but anyway, he led by example, and he was able to do this coalition, and he was able to put some of his partners' interests first too. It wasn't just about what he could accomplish. So I think of he's right up there for all the different leaders I studied during this project. Definitely came away with some admiration for Bernardo de Galvez.
And I'm glad to learn from you that Galveston, Texas is named after Bernardo de Galvez.
Yes, it is. Yes. So that's another added benefit. I'd love to go there someday. And when I do, I definitely will be telling everybody about Bernardo de Galvez as I'm walking around or asking them about it.
So, how does one judicially determine who gets to be featured as a revolutionary hero and who doesn't? Because Bernardo de Galvez, I had not heard about him until I read your book.
I think he was more well known at the time. And so I told you I read this old book written by Mercy Otis Warren, and he's mentioned, and Americans knew about Bernardo de Galvez in the early 1800s. And I think it was a period of time where his contributions and those of the Spanish more generally started to drop out of the history books, and the story of the Dutch dropped out of the history books. It became more, the people recognize the French were involved, but just the massive role they played, I think, has been minimized too. We remember Lafayette maybe and General Rochambeau, but not just all of the support the French provided in many different theaters. So that was a process that happened over years until it turned into just a story of Americans. So I would love for Galvez to kind of take his place again alongside these other American generals who also did heroic things.
Understood. Now, speaking about battles the straw that finally broke the British Empire's back, what was it about Yorktown that finally convinced the British to cave in?
So the Yorktown was a great victory. It was the greatest victory of the war for the French and the Americans. And I say French and Americans because there are actually more French at the Battle of Yorktown than there were Americans at the siege. This was where Lord Cornwallis, the British general, had his army of about 8,000 or 9,000 men that were trapped in a small peninsula in southeastern Virginia. They were bottled up by French ships, so they couldn't escape by water. And then the French and American army encircled them. So they had to surrender their entire army, which was a huge a huge victory. But it didn't mean that the war had to be over. And in fact, fighting continued for roughly a year and a half after that. And some of the biggest battles of the war happened after that. So what but this was outside of America for the most part. There were some smaller scale battles in America, but for the most part, Britain just preserved the status quo and tried to see what gains they could make elsewhere. And they made some really good gains. Actually, Britain actually won the last year and a half or so of the war. But I think what Yorktown did was just drive home for the British public and the opposition party in Parliament that the war in America was unwinnable. That this just showed that Britain was just pouring so many resources into it, and Yorktown, as you said, was the straw that broke the camel's back. In that, at that point, they finally realized, okay, we're not going to have any more major offensive operations in America. We'll see what we can clean up in the rest of the world, and maybe make up for it elsewhere and protect Jamaica, because France and Spain were still trying to take Jamaica. So the war continued, but the importance of Yorktown, I think, was really crystallizing the opposition to the war in Britain, and that's what convinced them to make a peace deal. They didn't have to. They still had a very powerful navy and army and could have kept fighting, but I think they realized that just perhaps as an analogy, like the U.S. did it in Vietnam. America certainly had plenty of military resources, but they finally realized this is not working, and it's time to stop. And that's what happened at the end of the Revolutionary War with Britain.
Understood. Do we know something about those opposition members of parliament in Britain who were vocal about seizing this war against America and calling it quits?
Yeah, there were some very prominent voices like Edmund Burke, the philosopher, and Charles Fox in Parliament. There had been a vocal opposition since the beginning of the war, but they were just very much in the minority, and it really took the loss at Yorktown and in 1782 finally, they became more ascendant and voted to end offensive operations.
Understood. My second last question would be about America's freedom coming at a great expense for Britain, of course, France, Spain, and also indirectly India, because Britain then decided we'll cut our losses with America and focus more on restraining and controlling India. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, it was the big winners in a way from the war. America, obviously, the biggest winner, won our independence, but all of America's allies and partners, for the most part, didn't fare very well. They certainly didn't get a return. I mean, they all made many sacrifices, lots of lives sacrificed, lots of money, and none of the allies and partners did very well. They kind of lost the peace, so to speak. And I say allies and partners because not all the different nations were formal allies with the U.S., but they're all fighting on the same side. So France, we've talked about it. They had their own revolution. They were deeply in debt and faced their own revolution. And some of the officers, some of the generals were even guillotined, who'd been heroes of the Revolutionary War. 7 years later, they were 8 years later, they were under the guillotine. So France didn't come. They gained a little territory, but they were not big winners here. Spain did gain the island of Minorca in the Mediterranean, which was a priority, and they gained the territory in the Floridas, which was really important for them. But they didn't achieve all of their goals, and eventually, as we were talking about earlier, they would face their own independent movements in Louisiana. The Dutch finally officially joined the war pretty late, but they fought in the last couple of years, and the Dutch Empire would crumble within decades as well. We didn't get a chance to talk too much about the Oneida Indians, but they are a nation of Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, in New York State, and they were actually America's first allies. They started fighting alongside Patriot forces in 1777 and made a lot of contributions. But George Washington was very grateful to them, and there was a treaty that was supposed to preserve their land, a federal treaty, but settlers from New York State nonetheless overtook their land and pressured the Oneida out. And not entirely. The nation is very strong today, but they suffered a lot from that. And then finally, India. we mentioned briefly the Mysore Kingdom fought alongside France against Britain and had some real successes. I think they inflicted the bloodiest defeat that the British faced per capita in the entire war in the Battle of Palalur, and had a lot of gains. But then ultimately there were two more Anglo-Mysorean wars after the Revolutionary Wars that did not go well for the Mysore Kingdom, and um, they eventually kind of lost their independence. So it's kind of maybe a bitter irony that all of these allies and partners that did so much didn't fare so well long term, and as we've been talking about, started to drop their contributions, started to be forgotten as well. That it kind of dropped out of the history books. So that's, I think, kind of an unfortunate part of this history, and that's another reason I want to try to bring it back and bring the memory back of all these peoples who helped.
Understood. My last question is going to be about the American War of Independence. The political act was achieved, but do you think the philosophical or spiritual ethos, in that sense, is the war still going on? Is America still at war trying to achieve independence in its truest sense?
Well, that's an interesting question, and maybe something for everyone to think about and come to their own conclusion. I don't know if I would say it's a war, but it's certainly, you could say it's certainly maybe a struggle that we've had as Americans since the foundings to think about those ideals and to try to live up to those ideals and to make them hold true today. So that's definitely been an ongoing process. I think what this whole process of traveling and learning for this book taught me was that America was interdependent from the start. That there was a time when we, the patriots, the founders, very much came to other countries hat in hand. We needed their help. We were desperate for their help, and and in some cases they had to overcome prejudices to do so. It was a predominantly Protestant country, and they had to find a way to make common cause, as Washington called it, with the French and the Spanish, who were Catholic and spoke a foreign language, and a lot of distrust. They had fought the French and Spanish in other wars when we were still English colonists. So they overcame that to kind of forge this coalition together. So that's one of the messages I take from, I see our founding different. And I think those ideals of cooperating with all these different people, I think that's really important to remember, and to remember that was how we started. So that's something I've taken away from this.
Understood. Thank you for authoring this book, Derek. This is an intimate personal journey and I got to witness this through your eyes with all its tragedy, tragicomic perhaps, and eventually culminating in success and leading us to where we are. Thank you for authoring this book and for giving me your time for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much and have a great day.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.